I'm Steve Pemberton, author of A Chance in the World. Some years ago, when I first put pen to paper, I believed I was writing a personal history, an origin story that maybe future generations of my family might read if they were ever interested. But over time, I came to understand it was never just my story. It was a map for those who might feel lost, a mirror for those who wondered if they were alone, and a message for anyone who has ever felt unseen, unheard, or unsure if they'd ever truly belonged. Books offer a story, but they also have an ending. A podcast, though, offers a conversation, a chance to pause, to reflect, to go deeper, to find a common story. So this podcast isn't just a retelling of a book. It's a reawakening of the truths it carries and an invitation to walk with them, especially when the road feels uncertain. This podcast is for anyone navigating hardship, holding on to hope, or searching for signs that healing is still possible. It's for the people I meet all the time who walk through the world carrying a quiet courage, waiting for a reason to believe that beginnings do not dictate endings, and that even in the hardest chapters, goodness can still find a way. So, if you're listening for inspiration, insight, or simply a reminder that the human spirit is not easily broken, well, you've come to the right place. Welcome to the Pemberton Podcast, a space for stories that lift, lessons that linger, and chances worth taking. Produced by David Alexander. As a boy, I didn't have the words to describe them. I just knew what they made me feel. Back then, I thought of them as monsters, and even now, with years of experience behind me and language at my command, that word, well, it still feels right. Time hasn't softened the edges. It's only sharpened them. I see them more clearly now, not just what they did, but what it took to survive them. And despite it all, I'm still here. Scarred, yes, but no longer afraid. Bent, but not broken. And that matters. Growing up in their shadow was like living through a storm with no name and no end in sight, the kind that rattles windows, hides the sun, and teaches you early how to brace yourself for impact. You do not come out of that untouched, but you do learn how to listen for the quiet before the break, how to protect the parts of yourself they can't reach, how to keep something lit inside. Survival isn't just about escaping. It's about defiance. It's about refusing to vanish. It's about holding on to your name, your voice, your experiences, especially when others try to erase it. It's a vow to keep moving. And this voice, this story, it's the proof that the beginning does not have to be the end. And I share it now, not to heal necessarily, or even to remember, but to simply reclaim. And for as long as I breathe air, there is some part of me that is always going to try to reclaim what was lost. In the book, I called them the Robinsons, in part because I knew they would never agree to signing a release authorizing me to use their real name. But the circumstances have changed since then, and now I can tell you their real name, Leftwich. It was August 1972. Watergate was just beginning to rattle through the country's consciousness, and I was a small, silent 5-year-old boy standing on the front steps of a 3-decker house on Arnold Street in New Bedford, Massachusetts. It was the home of Clarence and Barbara Leftwich, and their home on Arnold Street would soon become a symbol of everything I wanted to escape. By the time I got there, I was already a casualty of a well-intended foster care system that had also been stretched to capacity. In the 2 years since I had been taken from my mother, I'd been in several foster homes, and every one of them had left its mark on me. I was underweight, covered in bruises with scars old and new. My nose had been broken. An untreated ear infection had robbed me of full hearing and affected my speech. My skin was raw from a serious case of impetigo, and if you looked closely, you didn't need to ask what had happened. It was all there, plain to see. Finding families to foster children is challenging. It was then, and it is now. And so families like the Lefwiches, who opened their home to foster children, were seen as heroes. Over the years, they took in a staggering 39 children, some for a week or two, and others, like me, who had a longer placement. To the outside world, they were kind, selfless, and full of compassion. Social workers, neighbors, teachers, everyone seemed to believe the story they told. But what was really happening inside the walls of Arnold Street, well, that was a very different tale. The cruelty, physical, emotional, and psychological, wasn't occasional. It was the atmosphere I breathed. And maybe that was it. I just couldn't fully breathe. Food became a weapon, not nourishment, withheld or portioned out as punishment. There were no birthday parties, no sleepovers, no carefree afternoons with friends. The joy, laughter, and innocence that so often defined childhood for so many were absent from mine. Rather, each day began with a silent calculation. How was I going to survive? How was I going to avoid harm? How to make it through one more night under their roof without somehow losing another piece of myself. So each morning, when my feet hit the floor, I braced myself because I knew danger was coming, and the only question was how much I'd have to endure that day. Clarence Lefwich, the father, was a towering man with a short fuse. His temper was explosive, and he didn't hesitate to use physical violence. As a young boy, he was a real-life boogeyman, large, terrifying, and impossible to avoid. And yet for all of that, Clarence wasn't the one in charge, not really. That title belonged to Barbara Lefwich. And to me, she was the most destructive force in that house. Clarence might have been the enforcer, but Barbara, she was the one writing the script. And I knew, even as a young boy, that if I was ever going to escape, she was the one I had to defeat. Together, they created an illusion of stability and kindness that hid a much darker reality. Their motivation wasn't love or care. It was money, at least as far as I could see. They took in foster children for the income, and they worked tirelessly to protect it. And they fooled everyone, caseworkers, neighbors, my local elementary school, even the Harvard-educated family doctor. And me, well, I was the perfect cover. I had already lost my biological parents and had endured several violent foster homes, and my reaction to all of that was to become quiet and withdrawn. But the Lefwiches used my demeanor as evidence, proof that I was a, quote, damaged child, and that they were doing the best they could. It was a story they told well, and just in case I might develop the courage to tell someone what was really happening, they made it clear to me that I would disappear without a trace if I ever told anyone what was really occurring. But still, the signs were there, clear as day. I often went to school hungry, crying at my desk. One of my social workers noted in my case file that, despite all the family's accolades, she still had reservations about the Lefwiches because it seemed to her that I was being coached what to say. On another occasion, a hospital visit led to an intense discussion between emergency room doctors and nurses over whether the award-winning foster family was actually abusing me. And when I ran away 4 times in total, desperate to escape, those moments too went unnoticed or uninvestigated. The most vivid attempt at running away came in the 5th grade when I hid under the bleachers at the local high school with the help of my classmates, Ray Hernandez and Frankie Perry. For 2 nights I hid there, running around the football field, playing touch football with my friends, for the first time feeling the joy of being a carefree young boy. And for a brief moment, I found freedom in escaping from the Lefwitches and a sense of family from my childhood friends. I don't know if they'll ever know how important those days were to me. But that freedom would be short-lived. Nighttime cold and an unending swarm of mosquitoes drove me from my hiding place on the 2nd night. Without having anywhere to go, I sought out the only place that felt safe to me, my elementary school. When the police found me asleep on the front porch of a home by the school, I actually thought I'd be rescued, but that hope quickly changed to despair. The police brought me back to the Lefwitches, who spun a story effortlessly, once again painting me as a troubled foster child. They assured the police they would call my social worker, something they never did, because they knew I would be questioned as to why I had run away. And as for the incident, it only showed up in my case file months later, when Barbara Lefwich mentioned it to a social worker as evidence of the challenges I was presenting. All these years later, I'm still amazed that no one thought it strange that the Lefwiches did not immediately call police or social services to report me missing. Let me pause here to say something that matters to me, and I hope will matter to you. The Lefwiches were not the norm, not even close. Most foster families are truly extraordinary. They're quiet heroes who open their hearts and homes to children in unimaginable circumstances. And I know this because I've met them. I've seen the way they wrap children in warmth and stability, offering what every child deserves: safety, love, and the chance to start again. And the same is true of the vast majority of social workers. They wake up every morning and walk into heartbreaking situations armed with nothing but paperwork, persistence, and their belief that they can make a difference. They fight for children in ways most people will never see or understand. But the Lefwiches, they stood on the farthest edge of that spectrum, where kindness was a performance and cruelty hid in plain sight. I don't know if any amount of training could prepare a social worker for the kind of deceit they mastered. They weaponized the very system designed to protect children, and they did it with chilling precision. So no, I'm not going to spend much more time chronicling the fury they unleashed, not because it wasn't real. It was. It shaped me. I have the scars to prove it, but they are not the whole story. They never were meant to be. And there's another reason, one that runs deeper. To keep naming every wound, every betrayal, is to risk giving them a power they no longer have. I stripped that power from them a long time ago, and I'll be damned if I'm going to give it back to them now. What enabled me to survive, I think, was that I never saw myself through the lens the Lefwiches saw me. But they weren't the only ones. When I read through my case file, I saw the labels that were so frequently attached to me: at risk, underprivileged, abandoned, unwanted. Here's the problem with that. Labels can reduce a person's identity to a single story, to one experience or a circumstance. And worse, they can have a way of shaping how you see yourself. When someone hears those words said about them repeatedly, they might start to believe that that's all they are: a victim, someone to feel sorry for, someone less fortunate. Labels run the risk of telling the world what happened to you, but say nothing about what you've done in response. And that's the real story, isn't it? Who you became because of what you dared to fight for. While the Lethbridges might have persuaded everyone else around me that I was not worthwhile, they failed to sway the one person they most needed to convince, me. Refusing to let their lies define me became a quiet act of daily defiance. In many ways, it was the greatest gift I could have been given. And years later, I would come to understand exactly who had given me that gift. Somewhere during my elementary school years, I discovered an identity that came from a love of reading. Now, I can't recall anyone handing me a book or telling me how important reading was. It's just something I enjoyed, the new worlds I encountered, and the characters I read about. I read anything I could get my hands on, consuming books back then the way we consume social media today. Reading made me a good student, and also the undisputed spelling bee champ of Eleanor Hathaway School. I still remember the howls of protest from my classmates when it was announced that we were having the spelling bee. Why are we going to have a spelling bee, they said. We all know Steve is going to win. To which I was thinking, oh, you're damn right I'm going to win. This love of reading, though, gave me something else, something I see now would destine me to defeat the Lethbridges. It gave me a vision because in the books I read, I saw myself. In superheroes like Spider-Man who overcame impossible odds. Misfits like the little drummer boy who discovered he did have some gifts to bring after all. Or the relentless rabbits of Watership Down who lost their home but were determined to find another. Those were the stories that became my refuge and my guide, teaching me that life was so much bigger than the narrow, confining narrative of the Lethbridges. So each book I opened, each page I turned, became a small rebellion against them, a quiet but defiant declaration that my life could be more than what they sought to reduce it to. Through reading, I saw worlds that I couldn't unsee, and so I began to set my sail for those magical places. And in those worlds, I learned that I wasn't alone, that others had fought battles too, and had emerged victorious. And if they could do it, then maybe, just maybe, I could too. But first, I was going to have to escape them. How exactly I was going to do that was the biggest challenge of all. Running away had turned out to be a really bad idea. My case file showed years where I was never visited by a social worker. And at some point, I understood that my parents, whoever they were and wherever they were not coming to rescue me. And on top of that, there was an invisible inheritance that I was completely unaware of at the time, that I was actually the third generation to be orphaned. All of these factors seemed stacked against me, tipping the scales toward a destiny of being weighed down. But by now, you know that didn't happen, don't you? You know something else intervened, some unseen force that altered my trajectory. I pored over my case file searching for clues, any indication of what that force was going to be. But there's nothing there. All the training my social workers had, all their years of experience, couldn't predict it. The Lethbridges certainly couldn't either. Because if they had, they would have fast-tracked my removal from Arnold Street, deeming me more trouble than I was really worth. But that force was light. Pure, unwavering, transformative light. It's clear to me now that's what it was. A force that cut through the darkness, illuminated a path forward, and simply refused to let me be consumed by the shadows that I had inherited and the others that had come to surround me. That light came in the force of these human lighthouses, people who illuminated a path for me, often without realizing it. They seemed ordinary, but nothing about what they did was ordinary. My love of reading was borne aloft by a kind neighbor who, noticing me reading the same book over and over again, began leaving a box of books on the front steps of the house on Arnold Street. Each week, the box would be there, filled with new stories, new worlds to explore, a quiet beacon, calling me to dream beyond my circumstances. The first spark of encouragement I remember coming from a spelling bee judge. She sensed my stage fright as I stood frozen at the microphone, and her response was to keep smiling at me, nodding her head with gentle encouragement towards the microphone. Her smiling gaze steadied my trembling spirit and gave me the courage to speak. The idea of college, a concept as distant to me as another planet, was first suggested by my 7th grade guidance counselor. He looked me in the eye, told me I was, quote, college material, and handed me a Boston College brochure, placing it in my hands like it was a torch meant to light the way. And then there was the Sunday school teacher, during my one and only visit to church. She patiently explained what prayer was, describing it as a private conversation with God, one that no one else could hear. In that moment, she planted a seed of faith, a light within me that I would carry long after I left. You see, each of these acts whispered to me quietly, "Steve, there's a way through this." And maybe that's what hope really is. Small things we do that illuminate a path through the darkness. Maybe hope isn't loud or obvious or dressed up for show. Maybe it's something quieter, more subtle. The gift of a book, a head nod, a gesture pointing towards a different path. Something that appears to be, at first glance, small and insignificant, but time teaches us that it was much more. Hope was a formidable enemy to the Lethbridges, though. Hope might mean that a young boy just might start developing dangerous ideas about his future. And that belief, however faint, could lead to something more concerning, exposing them. So as I headed into my high school years, a battle was destined to unfold, and it was a battle that I was almost guaranteed to lose, as had many of the other foster children who had come through their home. As I entered high school, I was determined to get to college, and Boston College specifically, because of the idea that my guidance counselor had planted in me a few years prior. But I had no understanding of the process, no idea how to get started, or what classes to take. And I also knew college was incredibly expensive. While eating lunch in the school cafeteria with Ray Hernandez, my childhood friend, he mentioned to me that he was part of the Upward Bound program, a college access program for students from modest backgrounds. Now, the more he tells me about Upward Bound, the more I realize that this is the program I needed to get into. In my excitement, I started bombarding Ray with all these questions about how to apply. And I think I wore him out because he just said, finally, just go down to the Upward Bound office and they'll tell you what you need to do. I was there earlier today, and the staff's there. In fact, he said, the director has come in today. I made a beeline to the office, and Ray was right. The staff was there, and the director too. And that director, well, that director turned out to be a very familiar face, the spelling bee judge from several years prior. And as soon as she saw me, she said, "I remember you. You're the spelling bee champ from Hathaway School." Amazingly, she had remembered me. Marjorie Darton was her name, but she was known throughout New Bedford as Ruby, and that's very much what she was. She was an elected member of the New Bedford School Committee, the director of the Upward Bound program, and as it turns out, a part-time spelling bee judge. Ruby was a titan in the New Bedford community, and her name was synonymous with integrity, toughness, intelligence, and grace. She was deeply faith-abiding and believed with all her spirit that God had put her here to be an advocate, a door opener, she often said, and especially for young people. She was deeply respected, if not revered. And maybe that's why the Lethbridges stopped their delay tactics when it came to me applying to the program. Ruby would see me around school and ask me where my application was, and I would come up with one excuse after another. Of course, I couldn't tell her what they had told me, that there was no way I was ever going to get into that program. What they weren't counting on, though, was Ruby calling the house to ask Barbara Lethbridge when she could anticipate seeing my application. I vividly recall eavesdropping on that conversation because so much was hanging in the balance, and I heard something from Barbara that I'd never heard before. Fear. She knew full well not to cross swords with Ruby Doughton. The program became a lifeline for me. The path to college and away from the Lethbridges was clearer now than ever before. But Barbara, well, she had a few more tricks up her sleeve. She resorted to calling the Department of Social Services to tell them the Upward Bound program was emboldening me, creating discipline problems at home, she said, and that I needed to be removed, and that they should be the ones to call Ruby. When they did call Ruby, they ran headlong into her advocacy, ultimately reaching a compromise that one of her tutor counselors in the Upward Bound program, a John Sykes, should sit down with me to further discuss the situation. That conversation turned out to be incredibly consequential, setting in motion a series of events that are still unfolding, even today. I'll come back to that, but for now, I can tell you that ultimately it was decided I should remain in the program. Her initial strategy having backfired, Barbara adopted a new one. She was simply going to refuse to complete any further paperwork on my behalf. Any permissions that were required, like taking college visits or registering for college entrance exams, were met with immediate rejection. For all that had unfolded in that house over the years, this tactic had the potential to be the most destructive of all. They had already taken any sense of a normal childhood, and now they were trying to take my future as well. And that I was not going to allow, no matter the cost. I began revealing to my social worker the small ways that the Lethbridges were blocking my pursuit of higher education. But the social worker made a critical mistake. He believed this was nothing more than a minor dispute between a rebellious teenager and his foster parents, and so he tried to encourage me to resolve it myself. But that was never going to happen with the Lethbridges. And when they got wind that I had been talking to him, they began ratcheting up the pressure on me and my social worker. With me, they forced me to quit the track team and the debate team, further jeopardizing my chances of going to college. For my social worker, that pressure meant calling his boss and effectively removing him from my case. When his replacement began asking the Lethbridges harder questions, they had her removed too. That was a difficult moment, I can tell you, because it felt like I was never going to escape their suffocating grip after all. But this time, it would be the Lethbridges who made a mistake. In removing my last two social workers, they unknowingly extended an invitation to one Mike Sylvia. Mike was a seasoned social worker, and from the moment I met him, I knew he was different. Unlike prior social workers who avoided confrontation with the Lethbridges or were intimidated by them, Mike was simply immovable. And because he was, for the first time ever, I had someone I could tell what had really been happening in the Lethbridges' home for the past 10 years. But I sensed it wasn't going to be easy, and I turned out to be more right about that than I could have ever imagined. To escape them once and for all, I was going to need a miracle, and one would come from the most unlikely of places. Because miracles, like hope, don't always show up when we expect them, and sometimes they require us to take a leap of faith into the unknown. In the next episode, I'll share how that unexpected turn would change everything, and how I learned that sometimes, even when the odds are stacked against you, the right people and the right moments can make all the difference. At least it did for me. If something you heard today moved you, stayed with you, or made you think differently, I hope you'll share it. Over the years, I've come to see that our stories, when shared, really can light the way for someone else. If this episode has resonated with you, consider subscribing, leaving a review, or simply passing it along. This is the Pemberton Podcast, produced by David Alexander. Thanks for listening.